You're listening to Transformation at Work, your one-stop guide to Salesforce success. And this is Gerent 411, your up-to-the-minute source on the latest breaking news and developing trends in and beyond the Salesforce ecosystem. From macroeconomic events to implementation questions, legislative changes, and more, our team of experts are here to provide the updates you and your business need to thrive in a constantly evolving industry landscape. So, you did it. You've done the work. You brought your teams together, worked with a technology partner, overhauled your processes, identified your pain points, deployed the technology, held the trainings, and now, finally, at long last, you can say, you've deployed Salesforce for your organization. Now what? For many institutions, once they reach this point, well, that's it. It's over. Back to business as usual. They might run a few cursory surveys after the fact, but for the most part, despite millions of dollars spent and weeks or months of training, they fail to monitor exactly how Salesforce is impacting their business and what that adoption is looking like long term. And that lack of planning, well, that can have pretty serious consequences. I mean, after all, if you're not tracking how an implementation is going post-launch, how do you improve it? How do you justify the ROI? How do you confirm that this was the right move for the business? For teams that have launched Salesforce or are looking to do so, the reality is this. Building that post-launch plan that tracks KPIs and monitors and makes sure that employees are using the technology and that it's getting the results that you want is an absolute must when it comes to a successful Salesforce implementation. In this episode of Transformation at Work, we're sitting down with Dan Waldner, Gerent's Vice President of Financial Services, to talk through what that evaluation process looks like and how to make sure that employees are meaningfully adopting Salesforce after the implementation is complete, and that Salesforce is delivering the results that you're looking for your business. Dan brings years of technology experience to the conversation, with the majority of his career focused in financial services specifically. In that time, he has owned Salesforce for multiple enterprise-level organizations totaling more than 5,000 users across 16 countries. That experience means he's seen firsthand how important tracking success and ensuring long-term adoption post-implementation can be for an organization. We begin by looking at the lay of the land and asking the question, how's your average business tracking success with a Salesforce implementation post-launch, and what are the consequences for those businesses that aren't doing so? Here's what Dan had to say.
Looking back at the history of all the firms that I've worked with in terms of rolling out Salesforce, most don't have that foresight to be able to sit there and think through what does success look like from the perspective of the end user and adoption. They have a sense for, we want to make sure that we have high adoption on platform once we roll it out, but they don't put into a plan how we're going to measure what success looks like beyond simple logins. If you're rolling out Salesforce for 100 users, you want to see that all 100 users have logged in during the course of a week, minus those who may be on vacation or leave. And if they're on Salesforce, they must be using it successfully. Therefore, it must be working the way that we hoped. And that is it's a binary metric, and it's not one that's really good for measuring the return on investment that a client has really invested in Salesforce. And what often happens is when the clients first use it, when the users first get on the system, they use it because it's new. And they use it because there's hope that the system is going to be able to provide them with the tools to be able to do their job easier. That's what everyone goes into these saying, the management has invested all this money. We're going to go in, we're going to use it. We're going to give it a good old college try. And then over the course of a couple of weeks, you start to have degradation of users as they get in there and they realize this is different. This is not what I was expecting. This is harder than what I was expecting, or this doesn't make any sense. And they have negative feedback as a result of the implementation that goes unheard of. And then that starts to trail off with adoption. And then you start to get into a very unhappy place where you spent all this money and not many people are using it.
So it's clear that not tracking that performance can have a profound impact on an institution, and that teams looking to meaningfully evaluate how Salesforce is impacting their business should be watching key metrics even long after the implementation is complete. But that raises another big question, which is, what metrics? If I'm a team leader, what are those specific things that I should be watching for that will tell me whether or not the implementation was a success, or if our team is running into specific pitfalls that need to be addressed before we can meaningfully take advantage of the solution. Here's Dan with his thoughts.
One should have a sense for what your metrics look like pre-Salesforce. Our traditional use cases that we get brought into many of these implementations are, I don't have a good sense of my sales pipeline. I don't have a good sense of my service pipeline. And I need Salesforce to be able to help manage those two effectively. From a financial services perspective, we also want to have a single pane of glass where I can go into one of our customers' records and be able to see everything that they've got with the firm in one place. And having that view of the situation to be able to gauge what does our sales pipeline look like now and what does our sales pipeline look like post Salesforce lets you kind of reach through the usability metrics and actually get into the meat and potatoes of what we're hoping we're going to be measuring on this. So you could have a small credit union that has, let's say, $20 million in CD pipeline that they've got in a pre-Salesforce world. Do you have 10 million in Salesforce? Do you have 30 million in Salesforce? And is the delta a result of the people at the firm not using the system, not knowing how to put in the information into the system appropriately? They're not reporting on the information appropriately. So all of those elements go into the same output. But question, what are our metrics? What do we look like? Well, what are the metrics that matter to your firm? Right. So like I said, sales or service, those are the things that we should be looking at. And adoption is one of the reasons why those metrics don't align to what your expectations were.
But even if you're tracking the same metrics that you always have, you're doing so with new technology, and you want to make sure that that technology is being used, especially after you've spent millions of dollars and months of training to make sure that that tech gets deployed. Let's hear from Dan on how institutions can make sure that that adoption happens and continues to happen long after an implementation is complete.
When I advise clients on the change management approach, right, I'll use a very common industry terminology, the carrot and stick approach, to being able to incentivize people to use a system that's new to them, right? And when you look at what our customers are coming to from the perspective of the before situation, they're often Excel spreadsheets, there's antiquated systems that are like really like green screen type things, like really outdated things that are terrible to use. But people who are currently at the firm have used it for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And so as bad as the tools as those are, that's what they know, and that's what they use, right? So when you look at what some of the best practices approaches are for adoption, when you get into the post go live, having a tool that's evident as being easier and simpler and, snazzy like Salesforce is, doesn't mean that it's just going to be picked up easier from the people who are using it, because they're used to what they're used to, even though it's worse. So the first thing that we talk through is, let's make sure that we have the appropriate change management approach, that we have training and documentation and communication. So we're letting people know ahead of time that these changes are coming. And so we're going to make sure that they know what they're doing. And we're going to make sure that they feel comfortable and that there's routine training opportunities to people who might be having problems, might be struggling, that they can get help, right? And then the second thing is, right, and if you look at why adoption tends to trail off, it's often not that we didn't build it the way that it needed to be built. It was that the requirements that were passed on to the partner, aka us, may not have been in alignment with what the reality of the processes are, that our stakeholders that we liaise with tell us this is the way that it works. And that might not be true. Or it may be that there are additional processes that are required we didn't find out about, that didn't actually make it into production because it was never expressed to us, right? So there is a gap that's making their lives more difficult. It's a gap to adoption for this new particular system, which is why they're not using it, right? So having a feedback mechanism to be able to surface these objections up to the product owner or the project team to be able to say, hey, you got a problem here that's going to negatively impact adoption. We need to go and figure it out so that we can make a change so that people are happier, right? If there isn't that feedback loop, if there isn't the feedback that goes up and it gets addressed and then it gets implemented so that people are happier, then people get despondent. And when they're using a system that they don't feel is adjusting to what their needs are or isn't going to work for them, then they just stop using it. And that's generally what happens. But having that having those two things, the training and the feedback loop, those are important. And, we could buy people cupcakes or like birthday cakes to get them, to incentivize them to use these things, but those are temporary solutions. The reality is, though, and most of the time, those little gaps get covered off, like things that are problematic with using Salesforce will get identified, will get remedied, and then there will be no more excuse, right? And then we need to look in the mirror to say, okay, so the system works. The system, people are advocating for it inside the organization. It works really well. They're tracking the stuff they need to track when they're tracking it, but they're just not tracking it. And that's when you get into, well, if it doesn't live in Salesforce, then it doesn't exist, which goes to your leadership, making sure that they're only looking at Salesforce for their project status reports. And so they're not accepting Excel spreadsheets. They're not opening up side doors or back doors to your own internal adoption processes that would end up hurting the overall implementation.
Now, those gaps, those side doors, back doors, workarounds, we're supposed to accept this in Salesforce, but an Excel spreadsheet is fine. Those are cracks in the foundation that can cause a ginormous problem when evaluating Salesforce's impact on an institution. Because once those start happening, team leaders can be presented with numbers and metrics which, as Dan points out here, might not be reflective of reality.
If we're assuming that if it's not in Salesforce, it doesn't exist, then is the reason why our data is poor in terms of the amount of data that we have, is it because that's reflective of reality, or is it reflective of that lack of adoption? If you just implemented Salesforce and you're, let's say, 2 or 3 months into your implementation, and let's say you're a credit union or a regional bank, and you're looking at your sales pipeline and you see like a number of like $2,400 in your sales pipeline. Is that because we have $2,400 in our sales pipeline, which is a nightmare scenario? Or is that because nobody's putting anything into it? And so it requires the actual management and the executive of the organization to understand what is real versus what is being projected into Salesforce and why there's that delta. Those pitfalls, the largest pitfall in that situation is just understanding if what you're looking at is a full representation of reality, or if it's just merely a byproduct of things like lack of adoption or poor processes or even poor reporting. It could be that everyone's putting things into your system appropriately and they're doing what they should be doing, and the number should be $27 million for the last week. But the reality is the reports aren't configured correctly, or the metrics aren't reflecting those metrics that you're expecting based on a bunch of different situations.
Now, that philosophy, if it's not in Salesforce, it does not exist, is a key concept in ensuring high levels of Salesforce adoption long after the implementation is complete. It's a great stance to take if you can make it a reality, which is its own challenge for team leaders and managers. Here's Dan's advice on how to make that a reality.
It starts from the very top. If the CEO or a senior leader, depending on the scope of your Salesforce implementation, the very top of the pyramid only accepts Salesforce as a report, then his or her leadership team will only accept Salesforce as a report, and their team, et cetera, all the way down the line. What you often see happening is that there will be leaders in that organization that choose not to. And then that causes a schism within the organization. This team isn't on Salesforce because they choose not to. So it's got to start from the top. It's got to start from the senior leadership or even the CEO themselves and work their way down. And having your product owner or the internal implementation team, as it were, front and center and open to feedback within the organization to say, hey, I own Salesforce. We implemented this along with our Gerent partners. We're open to feedback to how we can make this better and easier and make sure that it works for your process. You can't just say no. Got to make sure that you're letting us know if things are amiss or there are things that we can improve upon. Having that internal communication and that internal representative to own the Salesforce implementation for the firm, that adds as the beacon of light so that people have a way of expressing if there are issues with the implementation that's negatively impacting their adoption rates.
Once that top-down commitment is in place, it flows through every level of an organization and gets to a point where any employee, regardless of position, can spot when data doesn't match up with reality. That, as Dan breaks down here, is a really powerful place for an institution to be in when it comes to evaluating how Salesforce works within an organization.
If it doesn't live in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. Okay, that's first of all that's the approach that I'm a big advocate for. And it is relatively radical, right? But if that's true and that everybody's entering everything into Salesforce, then at the very lowest level, the branch manager or the MCS at a particular branch location who is having meetings about their pipeline and meetings about, the performance of their mortgage brokers or their investment specialists or whatever the role is, they should be able to see, hey, you've only got $10,000 in your pipeline this week. You're normally at $50,000, right? Or whatever it is. Then they can interrogate the granular question with the individual contributors to the overall system. And so I think you would see that in that perspective, one branch out of a network of, say, 30, if I'm looking at my team as a manager and I'm going through and making sure that all of their things align, I'm going to be able to spot where the flaws in my team, my small team, are respectively. And then if I take one step up the chain there, now, if every branch has gone and done that appropriately, now the head of the branch network or the region or the district will be able to also boil their reports up accordingly to figure out what's going on there as well. So it starts at a granular level to figure out, if I've got a team of 10 and I've got $2,500 in my pipeline, chances are only one person's putting it in and the other 9, let's say, are not entering it, or they're entering it incorrectly, or the reports aren't working appropriately. But that really helps get down to the nuts and bolts level of where these metrics are going off the rails. And then once we've kind of figured it out and had that aha moment to say, this is why things aren't aligning, then that same solution can propagate to other branches, other departments, all the way up the chain of command to get those numbers to where they need to be. If it's a problem, it could also be that that's the reality. And if the reality is you only have $2,500 in your pipeline, buckle up. It's going to be a very interesting quarter.
Then, once the processes are in place, the reports are accurate, and the employees are actually using the technology, well, studying how Salesforce is impacting the business is as simple as studying the data that's already there. Here's how Dan puts it.
It goes back to dependability and reliability on the numbers and on what Salesforce is showing you, right? When you have a low adoption rate, you doubt the numbers that you get out of the system, right? You don't know if they're fully reflective of reality or you've got holes or gaps. But when you have a high adoption level, metrics start to fully resemble reality. So now you're not looking at the veracity of the data per se, you're looking at the data. So now you're not looking at, well, this one branch has only done 10 million in the last week. Why is it only at 10 million, right? Which is it's kind of like an introspective perspective, like what's wrong with this data? Now you're looking at the data as truthful and you're analyzing why the data is the way that it is. And now you start to look at macro questions, right? So where the data is poor, well, who's not putting it in their information? Is the reports are broken? Do we have issues with Salesforce? Do we have issues with the people using it? That's not good because you're not looking at the data. Now, when you have full adoption, people know how to use it. They're trained up on the system. People like it. Now the question becomes, okay, so we've done $10 million at this branch. How do we get to 15? Right? How do we get it to 20? Now you're looking at the numbers you should be looking at. You're looking at revenue. You're looking at growing your bottom line. But when you're still kind of stuck in the mud with how do we get people to use this tool, you can't actually benefit as much as you need to from the investment that you've made in the tool because you're worried about making sure that the numbers are accurate. It's kind of like if you want to use an analogy, it's like making sure that your books are balanced. I'm going to use an accounting perspective, right? When you know that numbers aren't aligning and the debits from this one column don't align to the credits on this column and things are all over the place, you stop looking at the numbers and you start figuring out why the numbers don't work. And so you're no longer worried about the bottom line. You're worried about finding the flaws and where those reports are. And once the reports are accurate, now you can look at what the data actually represents because you trust it. And now you can look at making strategic decisions to grow the important numbers and shrink the bad ones. I'll leave you on one last note. One of my senior executives from a previous lifetime had a very famous expression that he used all the time. You can't manage what you can't measure is a very important part to not just Salesforce, but data in general. So coming up with the ways of measuring your data and the ways of measuring those important metrics that your organization drives their success off of, and then being able to ensure that those metrics are accurately reflective of reality is a critical part to not just Salesforce, but the survival of your entire organization.
As Dan put it really nicely, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And for any business, especially in financial services, managing Salesforce and making sure the technology is successful post-implementation is really about measuring the results that matter. It's about making sure your employees are using the technology, that the right data is being collected, and that the right processes are being followed at every level of the organization. Again, like Dan said, if it's not in Salesforce, it does not exist. By achieving that kind of singular focus and uniformity in reporting, team leaders can focus less on the tech and more on the data, because that's the thing that is going to show if the business is going to grow year after year after year. This has been Transformation at Work. Thank you again for listening, and thank you to Dan for your awesome contributions on this episode. Transformation at Work is, as always, produced by Gerent in collaboration with Salesforce. I am Jeff Stormer, your host and producer. If you enjoyed the show, consider leaving us a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify, or head to gerent.com to sign up for email updates when we release new episodes. Until next time, thank you again for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.